Goed, goedenavond. Welkom allemaal. Voor alle Nederlandse volgers van deze Zoom-meeting. De rest van zowel de instructie als zometeen de informatie zelf zal allemaal in het Engels zijn. Dus vandaar dat we nu overschakelen op het Engels, zodat de heer Berman ons kan volgen. Welcome everybody. We are going to host this meeting in a bit. But first, let's talk some house rules. Nothing special, but please, if you have questions, you can ask them via the Q&A function in this app. So at the bottom corner of your screen, next to the share option, you'll find the Q&A function. There you can ask your questions. We'll bundle them, and after Mr. Berman is finished with his talk, we'll ask them your questions. So my name is Bart van Dijk. I work as a policy advisor in Israel and the Middle East for the CD organization. And I think that, in a sense, domestically and internationally, the result of the US elections have been, in a way, largely overshadowed by the shocking events that took place on our own doorstep here in Amsterdam. But nonetheless, these results of the US elections are very important for the future of the world, but also the Middle East, of course. And to interpret the effects and the foreshadowings of these results of the second Trump administration for the Middle East region and for Israel and Iran, we have here the senior vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council, and experts on global terrorism and radical Islam, but also on Russia, Iran, and the broader Middle East region on both security and policy issues. Doctor of Law, Ilan Berman. Ilan, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, and it's a pleasure to host you.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for providing me with the forum. I can't promise that I have all the answers about what a second Trump administration will look like, but as you can see from the news, things are moving very, very quickly. So we can begin to formulate some ideas and some opinions about what we're likely to see after January. So, okay, so let me launch into it because I think it's useful. First of all, it's necessary to understand that unlike 2016, when the election of Donald Trump was deeply controversial, there was a question about the split between the popular vote, which he did not win, and the electoral college vote, which is how the American system works, which gave him the necessary seats to become president. What you have now is a much clearer political outcome. The 4 years of the Biden administration, with all of the controversial things that have been associated with it, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a more lax and permissive attitude towards Iran in the Middle East, I would say a deeply unsatisfactory for Americans southern border policy, which has created an influx of migration, which Americans are beginning to grapple with. I know this is sort of top of mind in Europe at the moment. Different demographic context, but still very concerning for Americans. What all that combined for, additionally, what you saw over the summer was a very, very quick and undemocratic political transition in the Democratic Party, where within the span of just a few weeks, you saw President Biden being forced to step aside and Vice President Harris being selected as his successor with virtually no input from the voter base, the general voter base of the Democratic Party. It was sort of a selection that was done in the middle of the day. Notably, it was a selection that was done partially because President Biden is still president. And he was not asked to step down and having Vice President Harris take over all of his duties and functions. Rather, all he did was he said that he would not stand for re-election, meaning that she had the freedom not to own the policies of the Biden administration but still to compete as the candidate, and to do so, frankly, in a process that was very much stage managed by elders in the party, and it was seen very negatively, not only by Republicans, but also by Democrats themselves. So all of that conspired into what we saw on November 5th, which was a resounding victory for President Trump, President-elect Trump. And there is really no doubt, and the final tallies are still coming in from just a few states where House of Representatives races haven't been decided yet. But what's very clear is that he has a much bigger mandate. And what we've actually seen is a realignment of American politics in a much more conservative direction. So that's the framing that I think we need to understand as we look at what's happening, who's been appointed, what's likely to come next. So the second feature of this is that the Trump administration has been moving very, very quickly in terms of appointing key personnel and key figures. And we've seen this as we're recording this today. We've seen the most recent appointment was the appointment of Peter Hegseth, a former Army major, as the Secretary of Defense. That's a somewhat controversial decision. Others are less so. The selection of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee to be ambassador to Israel, for example, has been broadly seen as a very pro-Israel and a very solid selection. So too, the selection of Florida Senator Marco Rubio to be Secretary of State. This was seen broadly as a sort of a mandate for a much bigger and frankly, not an isolationist, but an internationalist foreign policy. So I think on all these fronts, we're seeing this move very quickly. But, and I can tell you this, I'm sitting here in Washington, it's moving very opaquely, not transparently. There is a government agency called the GSA, the General Services Administration, which is tasked with many things, but one of the taskings that it has is to administer and provide support to transitions from one administration to another, from one president to another. They actually have offices near the State Department. I've been there, I've spent time there. They provide the infrastructure, the technological and administrative backbone for transition teams as they take office. And this was where the Trump administration, in its first iteration in 2016, began to formulate its policies, began to brief folks who were selected for cabinet positions, began to formulate policies for the agencies and so forth. This year, what we're seeing is that the GSA, the General Services Administration, is really a very marginal actor. The Trump administration is really not in a trusting mood. It felt like the process in 2016 has not gone as well, was undermined from within, did not go as well as it should have. And therefore, it is doing most of the transition right now remotely. It's not doing it in Washington. It's doing it actually based out of Florida, based out of in and around the Mar-a-Lago Hotel and golf course where President Trump resides. And that means that what we're seeing and what the audience here is seeing in the press is very often not well known in Washington ahead of time. The selection of Hegseth, for example, was a complete surprise to very, very many people who were involved and were sort of watching closely the debate, the unfolding debate over Secretary of Defense. I point this out because I think it's important, because the opportunity for surprise here, I think, is much greater. This is not some of the names have been floated. Some of the names for additional cabinet postings are very likely to prove out over time. They're likely to be the people selected that have been named and have been suggested. But there is a much greater potential for surprise here in an administrative and a personnel fashion. And the reason I say this, and the reason I start with this, is because it is a truism here in Washington that personnel is policy. Who you select into key positions will determine everything, or almost everything, about what your policy and what the policy implementation actually looks like. So everything I'm going to say from this point forth is footnoted. It's caveated by the fact that we don't actually have full clarity on the team, and we don't even have full clarity on the process. But that being said, things are beginning to take shape. both in terms of Middle East policy, in terms of Israel-U.S. relations, and also broader American foreign policy writ large. So I think what we're seeing is between the nomination of Elise Stefanik for New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik to be the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And remember, Stefanik was the one who cut her teeth on the very public hearings that we certainly watched here in the United States. I suspect that the audience watched in Europe as well, trying to hold to account U.S. universities like the University of Pennsylvania and MIT and Columbia over this upsurge in not just anti-Israel sentiment, not just pro-Palestinian sentiment, but anti-Semitism that you saw explode across campuses after October 7th of last year. So Stefanik is a very vocal pro-Israel member of Congress currently, and she is liable to take that advocacy and that skepticism of the anti-Israel position with her to Turtle Bay, with her to New York when she takes the seat at the United Nations. Very much the same way that Nikki Haley in the first Trump term played the role of a blocker in the context of anti-Israel resolutions, played the role of an amplifier in the context of Israeli policy or pro-American, pro-Israeli regional policies that were advocated. I think you're liable to see the same thing at the United Nations. And certainly my colleagues here in Washington are celebrating her appointment. What that leaves open, I would point out, is the question of who is the point person for combating anti-Semitism, both in the United States and globally, right? That is an open question. Stefanik was on the short list to do that. She's been selected for something else. So the real question is twofold. Who is, and we'll find out in short order, who is going to be the Trump administration's special envoy to combat anti-Semitism? Because that's a huge job. It's previously been a largely symbolic job, but it is now a job with much more urgency, much more teeth, and much more international prestige. And second, and arguably more critically for American Jewry, is who is going to be the next Secretary of Education. Because the Secretary of Education will have broad latitude to set policies that, for example, hold at risk the accreditation of universities that don't provide protection for Jewish students. Hold at risk the eligibility of universities that have previously received federal grants from the U.S. government to receive grants into the future unless they put in safeguards that the Jewish community wants to see. So these are huge posts, and those posts haven't been filled yet. So we have yet to see on that front. In the context of foreign policy, the selection of Mike Waltz, a former Special Forces soldier and very outspoken, very pro-Israel member of the House of Representatives from Florida, to be National Security Advisor, combined with Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State, I think really very squarely puts Trump foreign policy in a more internationalist than isolationist vein. And this is important because I know all of you who are watching have been eyeing this contest closely, probably more in the context of Ukraine. And that chapter has yet to be written. But there has been this open question about what shape Trump foreign policy will take and whether or not a Trump second term would effectively zero out funding for Ukraine. I think the answer to that isn't quite clear yet. What we have in Rubio and in Waltz are very strong advocates of Israel, very strong opponents of Iran, and very strong opponents of China. The two tend to differ on Ukraine. Waltz most recently wrote by invitation a column in The Economist in which he talked about the need to essentially unshackle Ukraine and give them additional aid and let them win quickly. But that quickly is the operative word, because President Trump, and by the way, the operative word that applies to Ukraine, but also applies to Israel, because President Trump has said both to President Zelensky and to Prime Minister Netanyahu that what he wants to see is he wants to see a very rapid resolution of their respective conflicts. I don't think he cares so much about the details. I think he cares very much about presiding over protracted conflict that could become something bigger, could implicate American interests could involve American troops, boots on the ground. These are things that he wants to avoid. So there is very likely going to be a diplomatic push in the context of Russia and Ukraine. I think there is going to be a much more breathing room in the context of Israel, particularly if you have a situation where Israel is moving quickly and breaking things like it's doing now in Lebanon. That looks like, for American analysts, it looks very much like Israel has regained strategic momentum, has rebuilt its strategic credibility. That is something that the Trump team, I think, likes very much. The Trump team is far less concerned about the potential for escalation than the current Biden administration is. And in fact, some in the Trump orbit would actually welcome it in the context of the Iranian nuclear program. There's a much more serious understanding of the fact that time is running short on preventing Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. There are many in the Trump orbit that expected Israel in its last retaliation at the end of October to actually go out and target the Iranian nuclear sites, not just limited military targets. In fact, President-elect Trump, then he was candidate Trump, actually said that publicly, that he believed that Israel should go out and do that. Israel chose not to do that, but that is a decision point that has yet to be arrived at on the part of the Israelis. A lot of it depends on what Iran does next. As we're recording this, the Iranians may still respond. The Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, has said that Israel can expect a sharp and complex response to its reprisal attack of October 26th. We haven't seen that yet. There was an expectation that the Iranians were going to do it last week during America's election week when America was distracted. They didn't do that. And I think they didn't do that because the correlation of forces has shifted very dramatically in Washington, and the Iranians are worried about doing something that could actually bring America into the strategic conversation, make America a more direct, active player than it is currently, because Iran has experienced a pretty dramatic reversal of fortune in recent weeks. And here, let me sort of step aside for a second and talk about that, because I think it's important to understand what comes next. As recently as this summer, if you were sitting in Tehran, your glass was half full. But by this, I mean that, you could count as part of your strategic victories the fact that your terrorist proxy, Hamas, had succeeded in denting Israel's aura of invulnerability, that Israel's subsequent war in the Gaza Strip had isolated it internationally and made the case for Israel much harder to make on the world stage. And that the Abraham Accords, the normalization process between Israel and the Arab states that had started in 2020, but had proceeded the pace up until October 7th, had really ground to a halt. For the Iranians, this was a particularly important achievement because, first of all, the process by itself was beginning to marginalize the Islamic Republic in regional politics, but also because of what may have come next. Because by all indications, when October 7th happened, Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to a normalization deal that would have dramatically expanded the Abraham Accords and would have really put a nail in the coffin of Iran's strategic relevance in the region. So on all of these fronts, the Iranians, as recently as a few weeks ago, could count themselves as victors. But that's not the case today. Today, what you're seeing is a significant, dramatic reversal of fortune on the part of the Iranian regime because of what Israel has done against Iran's chief terrorist proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. Over the course of something like 11, 12 days, Israel managed to decommission thousands of high-level or mid-level operatives of the militia. Israel has managed to erode something like 75, 80% of Hezbollah's missile arsenal. And Israel has managed to decapitate the leadership of the organization. This is a huge blow, both to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has relied very heavily on Hezbollah in the past both to shape Israeli behavior, but also to project force into the Levant. And also, it has really allowed Israel to regain its strategic momentum. And so now, if you're sitting in Tehran and you're looking at the global landscape, the winds are blowing against you. They're not blowing at your back. And so I think it's useful to think about what may come next, because it has a direct bearing on what the Trump administration is likely to do in the Middle East. First of all, in the context of Iran, you're likely to see the Iranian regime embark on a very large conventional military modernization, both in defensive and offensive terms. Defensively, because the Israeli strike of October 26th really removed all the viable components of Iran's air defense architecture. And so the Iranian nuclear program, but also Iranian leadership targets, are effectively, for the moment, defenseless. And this is a huge problem. It's a huge vulnerability. So you're liable to see Iran try to rebuild that as quickly as possible. But also, with the attrition of Iranian proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, there is a sense in Tehran that Iran needs to spend money again where it used to spend money, which is on conventional warfighting capabilities, which over the last 2 decades have really taken a backseat to Iran's asymmetric capability, to Iran's drones and missiles and proxies. Iran is now, I think, focusing more and more heavily on conventional warfighting capabilities. And we know this because last week, the Iranian regime announced that in the next Iranian fiscal year, which starts in March, they are planning a 300% expansion of their defense budget, right? It's all about this. It's all about regaining deterrence. It's all about regaining strategic capability. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you're liable to see Iran, which is already a very repressive regime, become extraordinarily repressive against its internal opposition. Over the last couple of years, the Iranian regime has been on the back foot in strategic terms at home because of what has come to be known as the Woman Life Freedom Movement, which started as an outpouring of domestic discontent against the Iranian regime's restrictive religious clothing rules for women and associated policies, but has over time morphed into this fundamental rejection of the regime itself. And the real worry on the part of the Iranian regime is that now that the regime has been exposed as vulnerable, right? My friend Rich Goldberg, who served in the first Trump administration, phrased it as the Ayatollah has no clothes, right? Now that there is a perception that the Ayatollah has no clothes, both in strategic terms by international audiences, it could also be perceived that way at home. And they fear, right, the most immediate fear on the part of the Iranian regime is that the opposition will seize this opportunity to redouble its efforts to topple the regime. So you're liable to see a very, very strong reaction on the part of the Iranian regime aimed at its domestic opposition. And I think that's going to play out over the next several weeks and months. And the third, and this is, I think, the most important component for US policy and for Israeli policy, is what Iran plans to do on the nuclear front. Because up until now, the Iranians have been pursuing an incremental strategy. They've been, as I would say, salami slicing their way to a bomb. They've been making small incremental steps in their technological evolution, in the percentage of enriched uranium that they have, the percentage to which they enrich uranium. But all of this has been tactical, it's been small, it's been reversible, and it's been calibrated so as not to evoke a robust response, either from the United States or even from Europe. And that strategy was predicated on the idea that Iran had plenty of time. And I don't think that's the calculation anymore. Between what has happened in Washington and what Israel did in late October, I think there is a sense in Tehran that the clock is ticking. And so what you're liable to see is a change in Iranian strategy from incremental nuclear progress to a full-on sprint to nuclear status. You're likely to see the Iranian regime ramp up its capabilities. You're likely to see the Iranian regime partner more and more closely with countries like North Korea in the development of those capabilities. And the runway for Iran to do that is very short, right? And the estimates vary, but what we're looking at is somewhere between 6 and 18 months for them not only to enrich uranium sufficiently, right, which they've already mastered and they've managed to do, but also to miniaturize and weaponize and create a nuclear warhead that is possible to deliver onto targets. And those are the parameters that U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence is looking at. So this is a Trump second term problem squarely. And the question really becomes, what is Israel going to do about it? And what is America going to do about it? And I think there is an understanding that for the Israeli leadership, that the nuclear program is a problem that still needs to be solved. This is not something that Israel is willing to sit by and not address. The question is how they're willing to solve it and whether or not there will be American support for that. And I think what you're seeing in terms of personnel, because personnel is policy, is you're seeing a very permissive attitude emerging in Washington for Israel to do this, provided it does it in very short, very decisive fashion. Again, to reemphasize, the worry here in Washington is not about Israeli military action, at least not under a Trump term. Under the Biden administration right now, there's a worry about uncontrolled Israeli action, right? The emphasis in Biden administration Middle East policy is squarely on de-escalation, which you could make the case has actually prolonged Israel's military offensive in the Gaza Strip. The Trump administration is going to be under no such illusions. They're going to allow Israel to do what it needs to do. But they're liable to ask Israel to do it quickly and to do it decisively. And that is going to have a shaping effect on Israeli policy. What I think we're not likely to see, and where the zone of danger comes in, is if whatever Israel does next spins out into a wider conflict that brings in American forces, American allies, and even American soldiers. That is likely to receive more resistance from Washington. So this is, again, evolving in real time, but I think you can sort of see the writing on the wall. The language that Washington is going to be speaking over the next year in the context of Iran, it's going to be all about the nuclear program. And Israel has bought itself a little bit of time because it's removed air defenses and it's at least temporarily stopped Iran's ability to produce ballistic missiles. But that's not a permanent stop. And so time is working for the regime and it's working against Israel and against the United States. So this is probably the most consequential decision that's coming down the pike. And it's liable to come down the pike in the first year of the Trump administration. Here, the post of U.S. ambassador to Israel becomes very important because the U.S. ambassador to Israel is the frontline interface between the U.S. government and the government of Israel. And the appointment of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee, is, I think, a very solid choice. He is somebody who is well known in Jerusalem. He's somebody who's very well trusted in Jerusalem. And I think even more consequentially, because Israel is going to be the fast mover in the conversation, his views on Israel are very sympathetic, and he is liable to be able to make the case very eloquently for whatever Israel does to his boss back here in Washington. So I think on that score, everything becomes very much more permissive for Israel. I think the one caveat which we need to look at, because there is the truth that every war must end. And I know that we're not talking about the day after for the Palestinians right now, but we will be at some point. And ideally, we'll be talking about a construct that implicates the moderate Arab states of the Persian Gulf, that forces countries like Bahrain and Morocco and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia to become stakeholders and financiers of reconstruction in Gaza, because Israel has neither the desire nor the economic capability to do it. Nonetheless, we don't want to see, right, from an American perspective, we don't want to see a maximalist Israeli approach to the Gaza Strip or to the West Bank or to rebuilding, expanding settlements in the West Bank. I think there's a more permissive political environment now for that sort of advocacy. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who represents the religious Zionist contingent in the ruling coalition in Israel, chose yesterday, after the appointment of Huckabee, to make his first trip down to the Gaza envelope to speak to Kibbutz Nir Oz, to the residents of Kibbutz Nir Oz, and to talk about, among other things, the resettlement, not of the south of Israel, but the resettlement of Gaza. I think there is going to be a less than constructive tendency among certain parts of the Israeli electorate to try to stretch that envelope as much as possible. And that's going to be something that Washington is going to need to shape, moderate, and deal with. And that's why Washington has been saying in no uncertain terms that annexation of the West Bank, that Israeli freedom of action in the West Bank should not be assumed, right? It's all because of this. So this is, I think, where we stand. And I'll end with this because I've been talking for a long time, but I'll end with this. I think the other chapters of what we're looking at, the Ukraine chapter, the China chapter, are far less well written. I think given the appointment so far, it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be a more confrontational attitude vis-a-vis Beijing here in Washington after January 20th. I do not know what the future holds for Russia and Ukraine. I think the president-elect has made himself very clear that he wants to see a near-term solution. But if Vladimir Putin doesn't play ball, if Vladimir Putin doesn't like the terms that Trump happens to like, things could go very well for Ukraine. And with advocates like Mike Waltz suggesting that Ukraine receive greater freedom of action, I think the cup may not even be half empty for them. All that being said, I think there's an inherent danger here that we're all facing, right, collectively in the United States and also in Europe. We are still approaching these three fronts, the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe and the Middle East, as separate conversations. That Iran is different from Russia, is different from China. And I think that's a strategic error. I think it's a strategic error, first of all, because you see greater collaboration between all three on everything from disinformation to military exercises to alternative economic constructs. And also, it is a mistake because it is an opportunity for one of these countries, whether it's Taiwan or Ukraine or Israel, not to be left behind. Because there are advocates in President Trump's circle that talk about needing to focus on China, talk about needing to focus on Israel to the detriment of these other fronts. And the more it is possible to instill that this is actually an emerging axis, that this is a consolidated threat that threatens not only the United States, but also American allies in Europe and in the Middle East, I think the better off we'll be. And I'll end with this, the saying that my mentor said to me many years ago. He said, sometimes to make a problem smaller, you have to make it bigger. So I think that's actually very good advice for how we think about foreign policy in the Trump term.
Well, thank you, Ilan, for sharing your insights on this subject. Now's the time to submit your questions. I see two of you already did. So I'll just start off with the first two questions to you.
Sure.
The first one is as following. President Donald Trump, after his first term, was also called the first president ever who didn't go to war or incite war. What leverage could he use to create a situation by which Israel doesn't have to fight anymore? What could he do to stop the military enemies of Israel altogether?
Well, I think that's a good question. I also think, historically this is true, but it's also a little bit of a counterfactual, meaning when President Trump and his supporters say, if Trump had gotten a second term back in 2000, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. That may be true, but we don't know. And so it's very easy to say, it's actually harder to prove. But I do think it's indisputable that the aversion that the Biden administration has towards escalation of conflict, both in the Middle East and also in Europe and in Asia, has emboldened adversaries of the United States, including adversaries of Israel like Iran. So the real question here is, how do you rebuild that credibility? And here, I have to say, there's no substitute for seriousness. I think the first step has to be that you make American support unconditional instead of conditional. Today, when we're recording this, is the day that the 30 days of the Biden administration's ultimatum to Israel to expand humanitarian relief in Gaza or face a potential stoppage of military sales expires. Israel has done some, but not all of what Biden demanded. So now the ball is in the Biden administration's court to see if it's going to do anything. But that discrepancy And by the way, it's perfectly acceptable behind closed doors to ask the Israeli government to focus more on humanitarian issues. But in public, in a very public way, to demonstrate that Jerusalem and Washington are not aligned is a blow against the credibility of what is supposed to be an unconditional relationship. I think it's fair to say that under the Biden administration, the way Biden, despite all of his rhetorical support for Israel since October 7th, the way Biden has conducted the mechanics of U.S.-Israel relations, U.S.-Israel partnership, has injected doubts into the minds of Israelis and also given ideas to Israel's adversaries about the steadfastness of Washington's resolve. So I think the first step here is to rebuild that credibility, right? And that's done through closer defense partnership. That's done through closer intelligence coordination. That's done through U.S. declaratory policy that much more closely mirrors Israeli declaratory policy. And I would argue a very good place to start would be for America to adopt the Israeli framing of this not being a war between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel-Hamas, or even Israel and the Palestinians, but this is a war, this is a multi-front war between Israel and Iran. Because that gives you, I think, the proper context to incorporate what we're seeing in Syria, to incorporate what we're seeing in Yemen with the Houthis, and also to really set the stage as to what to expect in terms of next steps and also what to expect in terms of success. If Iran is deterred, if Iran's proxy network is eroded, the way the Trump administration tried to do in its first term in office, I think this would be a success for American Middle East policy, but it would also be a success for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Thank you for your clear answer. So one of the other participants has a question regarding the same subject, which is twofold. When will the U.S. give weapons to Israel it needs to attack Iran? And when will the obstruction of weapon deliveries stop?
So my sense is, I think with the next administration, I think with the next administration, you're going to see a very different conversation about weaponry that Israel has access to, and also this obstructionism, because I think the Trump administration is going to take a very different attitude towards Israeli victory. The current administration is, as I tried to point out, I think very risk averse, very concerned about a Middle East conflict becoming a wider conflict that implicates American interests. And let's be fair, the Trump administration is concerned about that as well. I think the Trump administration sees the route to preventing this, not pressing on Israel to pull its punches, but rather to do the opposite, to empower Israel to move fast and to be as capable as possible in the near term so that this isn't a protracted war. One of the interesting things to me is the question of technical capabilities in the context of the Iranian nuclear program, right? Because this is really the elephant in the room. Israel, as I'm sure all of you have heard, Israel currently lacks the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that it needs to really access and root out the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Here, I think it's useful to point out that this isn't just a problem of weaponry, right? If you talk to Israeli officials, I've spent a lot of time talking to Israeli officials about the Iranian nuclear program, what they'll tell you unequivocally is that they do not believe that they can completely stop the Iranian nuclear program. And that's because they think they know where everything is, but the program is hardened, it's mature, it's distributed, and there may be facilities, there may be components that they don't know. And that's why you've heard repeatedly the phrase mowing the lawn, right? What the Israelis are talking about is not a permanent stop to the Iranian nuclear program, but a setting back of the program by a number of years with the assumption that history will intervene. And here, right, let's make two historical analogies. In the early 1980s, Israel denuclearized Iraq, right? This was the raid on Iraq. And the expectation, right, based on my conversations with retired Israeli generals, was back then was that this would set the Iraqi program back by half a decade, no more. But the Israeli command authority believed that that was enough. That was sufficient in order to warrant such a strike. In truth, as America discovered to its great detriment with the Second Gulf War, the Iraqis never reconstituted their nuclear program, right? Because history intervened. Iraq may have wanted to, Saddam may have wanted to go for the bomb once again, but he was caught in the middle of a grinding 8-year war with neighboring Iran, and he was busy. Much the same way, the same holds true for the Syrian nuclear program, which Israel denuclearized, Israel eliminated in 2007 under the prime ministership of Ehud Olmert. The Syrians may have wanted to reconstitute their nuclear capability, but very shortly thereafter, in historical terms, the Arab Spring broke out, and then the Syrian civil war broke out, and then Bashar al-Assad had his hands full. So I think the Israeli hope or the belief is that the goal here is to mow the grass, to buy some time and allow history to intervene in a way that makes it harder for Iran to refocus on the nuclear enterprise.
Thank you. We have a question regarding the appointment of the Secretary of Education. You mentioned it before. It's going to be one hell of a job, but also a very important one. The question is, where's the fine line in increasing protection for Jews, say in schools, and not encouraging the increase of extreme Islamic rhetoric that even takes over many Western people's mindsets? What should be the primary focus of the Secretary of Education considering this?
Okay, so again, right, this is just my views, private American citizen, but I have to say that one of my biggest criticisms of the Biden White House has been how hands-off they've been on all this. Because I think almost without exception, every university that you've seen, where you've seen significant outpourings of Jew hatred, outpourings of anti-Israel protests, disruptive marches, and extreme behavior, are either now or have been in the past recipients of federal grant dollars. MIT, during the Cold War, was an incubator for the American defense industrial base, right? So there are very healthy, very long-standing relationships there. And the president, the current president, not the next one, but the current president could today still, I mean, it's the afternoon here in Washington, could still today issue an executive order that says future funding, future eligibility for funding from the federal government to your particular university is contingent upon adding additional safeguards to ensure equal access for your students, irrespective. And again, right, let's make this a little bit broader even than just Jewish students. Let's make this to minority students, to religious minority students, right? Equal access to facilities, to education, and to security for all minorities studying in your universities. I don't care how you do that, but do it, right? Or you will no longer be eligible. I promise you that these protests may not die off immediately, but they will become significantly more manageable over the course of something like 18 hours. The current president, because of political considerations, has not done that. And that is a job, not for the Secretary of Education, but that is a job for the next chief executive. And my sense is, with the input from the special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, whoever he or she may be, that's likely to be the case, right? Congress has already begun talking about the need to draft legislation to mandate things like this. People like Marco Rubio, who is now going to be Secretary of State, have talked about this. The Secretary of Education has a different job. I would argue it's a harder job, because what you've had in the United States has been, and I'm an intellectual outlier, I like to say, but I am a product of this system. A system that in the post-Cold War era has seen a growing orthodoxy of intellectual thought in academia. And you sort of see this by the fact that, you know, any number of studies that you could pull out, you could Google, you could point to, will tell you that the number of sitting faculty in political science departments that are Republican is vanishingly small. Right. And part of that is the nature of the beast, right? These are liberal arts colleges. They hew towards the humanities. Fine. But I don't think you have to be a Republican partisan to say that a political science department that is comprised entirely of representatives of only one political party may not be giving your child the diversity of viewpoints that he or she needs in order to succeed in life. And so to me, that is the biggest build that the next Secretary of Education has to do. The next Secretary of Education has to really reach into the ivory tower and take a look at how accreditation happens. And remember, accreditation is not a perennial process. It's one that comes up for renewal. So there are guidelines which would come out of the Department of Education that would, for example, could require universities that have regional studies departments or political science studies departments have representation from diverse political viewpoints and demonstrate representation from diverse political viewpoints in order to remain accredited. And that is a huge cudgel that the next Secretary of Education can wield. I think it depends on whether the person that's ultimately selected has the courage to do so.
Thank you. Do you think the next Secretary of Education also will have a different policy on foreign governments financing these universities? Let's say Qatar investing in education and stuff.
Right. So that's the second component. I didn't talk about that, but that's obviously hugely important. And by the way, in the context of the Middle East, obviously Qatar is a huge problem. If you were to ask the Qataris themselves, they would tell you, oh, no, we told these universities when we gave them this multi-million-dollar gift that they had to declare it, and the universities are at fault for not declaring. And then you get into this really interesting he said, she said. Well, who's at fault? Are the Qataris at fault or is the university at fault? I think there is now serious attention here on Capitol Hill to eliminating that argument altogether, to simply saying that universities either are barred, especially if they're state universities, are barred from receiving foreign gifts, or have to declare, as a matter of federal law, have to declare foreign gifts and publicize foreign gifts as a way of making American citizens who have college-age children more informed consumers about where they're going to send their children. But I would point out that this is actually I know you guys are looking at this mostly through the prism of Qatar and Israel, and I think that's absolutely apt. But here in the United States, the largest offender isn't actually Qatar, it's China. China has spent a tremendous amount of time and money in building, whether it's Mandarin linguistics departments, Confucius institutes in various universities, funding think tanks, funding area studies in a way that, and I have colleagues that know much more about this than I do, has fundamentally shifted the freedom of discourse about China over the last generation or so here in the United States in academia. And this is becoming a huge problem. And it's becoming a huge problem that increasingly it is a bipartisan consensus needs to be fixed. It is a hole that needs to be plugged. So I think you're liable to see pretty significant congressional action on this front, but it's going to be geared not just towards Qatar, it's going to be geared towards China as well.
Thank you. Then we have a next question from one of the participants. So in 4 or 8 years' time, a democratic US government could adopt the opposite policy to Trump ones on Israel. And future governments could switch again and again. Given this uncertainty, could Israel still rely on the United States in the long term?
So that's always the question. I would argue, I'm usually a pessimist, but in this case, I'm actually an optimist. I would argue yes. Because the through line of the special relationship between Jerusalem and Washington is never about administrations. It's always about Congress. It's always been about Congress. And what you've seen, so you've seen this ebb and flow. You've seen warm relations and frosty relations, right? Frosty under Obama, warm under Trump, frosty under Biden. Okay, now it's going to be warm again under Trump, right? So that's very predictable. But the congressional affinity for Israel is much deeper. It's much more bipartisan. And that's why when AIPAC does lobbying, for example, AIPAC lobbies Capitol Hill. They don't lobby the administration, right? Because that's where the center of gravity is for the relationship. And that's, I think, an important takeaway, right? Now, there's a footnote here. The American political environment is shifting. And what you're seeing more and more on the part, especially of the Democratic Party, is an anti-Israel progressive wing of the Democratic Party, right? Embodied by the members of the Squad, people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. That is true. That is absolutely a concern. There are people who, rising members, potentially rising power brokers that in the years ahead could actually exert more power and more influence to advocate some distance from Israel. I think that is, at least for now, that is mitigated by the fact that what we saw last week here in the United States was a pretty big realignment. It was a pretty big rejection on the part of the American public of the extremes that we saw in the preceding years, right? Everything from defund the police to anti-Israel sentiment to, emphasis on diversity, equality and inclusion in universities, right? Things like that. The American people essentially have given this administration a mandate to roll that back. And by giving the administration a mandate, they've sent a signal to the Democrats. It remains an open question whether or not they're going to actually absorb the signal, understand the signal to the Democrats that under Biden, they went too far to the left. They have to sort of reorient or recenter to the middle. And there are members of the Democratic Party, right? Proud members of the Democratic Party, like Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, like Congressman Richie Torres from New York, that are squarely center-left, that are squarely pro-Israel, and are advocates of this sort of moderation. So I think our job, American Jews, our job is to try to make their voices louder and those other voices quieter. But in a more concrete fashion, because I think the question is the absolute correct premise, right? Administrations come and go. How do you lock in cooperation over the long term? Remember that cooperation, as we currently understand it, is built around the idea that Israel is a security producer, not a security consumer. And so anything, and again, right here, we have yet to see, for example, if Jared Kushner comes back in a second Trump term. But already you can see the telltale signs that reviving the Abraham Accords and potentially expanding them to include Saudi Arabia are going to be a pretty large priority of the Trump administration in its Middle East policy. That is, I would argue, an unequivocally good thing because, among other things, it creates realities on the ground that will be hard for a future potentially anti-Israeli administration to undo, right? Just look at what happened over the last 4 years. The Abraham Accords, up until October 7th, they did not have the support of the Biden administration. The Biden administration would not even call them the Abraham Accords until a year had passed, until September of 2021. Before that, they would just refer to them as normalization or whatever it is, and they would denigrate them, right? President Biden's first press secretary, Jen Psaki, talked about how they actually created more problems than solutions, right? But that's not what you heard when you went to places like Rabat or Manama or Abu Dhabi, right? Those countries maintain their relations with Israel. And by the way, those countries maintain their relations with Israel now, as difficult as they are, because they're trying to navigate pro-Palestinian sentiment, because the inherent logic behind cooperation with Israel, which is a tech superpower, which is a very robust economy, makes sense for their development over the long term. The more you can broaden that base, the more you can broaden that conversation, the better off Israel is going to be over the long term.
Thanks again. One question about the United States and NATO relationship regarding the next Trump administration. I think you touched upon it briefly, but it's a concrete question. So how will this relationship develop under the new Trump administration?
So it's a huge question. I have friends of mine that are fairly important officials in NATO, and I've been having this conversation with them in recent weeks. And it remains to be seen. But I would point out this, that it is perfectly acceptable to criticize the form of President Trump's approach to NATO. But I think it's hard to argue with the substance. When the Trump administration took office, less than a third of NATO's now 28 members were meeting the 2% Wales threshold of defense spending as a proportion of GDP. Today, and NATO announced this when they did the summit here in Washington over the summer, 22 of 28 members have reached that threshold. And the push in Brussels right now is to increase that, to make every single member of NATO hit that Wales threshold. That is a function of two things. That is a function of renewed seriousness because the bear is at the door, right? Russia is right around the corner, and if they have some measure of success in Ukraine, they're going to be emboldened to move against NATO in other fronts as well. But it's also a fear that America may detach, may disengage if they're not serious enough. I actually think that that's a very good message. And by the way, you know that message is being internalized when the new EU foreign policy czar, Kaja Kallas, gives a statement. She gave a statement yesterday where she talked about how the EU has to get more serious about security vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis China. That is a statement directed at Washington. That is a statement intended to highlight to Washington that we hear you, we're working on it. So I'm very bullish about the idea that a more equitable burden sharing arrangement can breed enormous dividends. Because for a long time, Europe, and I say this as an American, right? No offense, Ben, but Europe has relied on America to carry a lion's share of the water. And this has been a perennial sore spot for Americans in both Republican and Democratic administrations. The Secretary of Defense under President Obama, Bob Gates, famously gave a talk about this in very scathing terms during one of his latter speeches in Europe. So it is incorrect to assume that this is a Trump priority. This is an American priority. And the more NATO officials understand that this is an American priority rather than a Trump priority that's going to go away with the end of his term, the better off we're all going to be. Within that new framework, the framework of more equitable burden sharing, I think NATO has a tremendous amount of power to sway how America thinks about adversaries. If Europe shows greater seriousness about China, and more importantly, greater seriousness about Iran and about curbing the threat of Iran, America will welcome that, I think, with open arms. And it'll breed growing closeness that'll bolster the U.S.-European relationship and it'll bolster the U.S.-NATO relationship.
Oh, thank you so much for tonight. I think we're done with the questions. Thank you all for attending as well and for submitting your questions. Ilan, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. I think with